All right. I know it's not quite 11:15, but why don't we go ahead and get started because I need to introduce Keith here. So Keith, I would say go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready. And while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and do your introduction here. So please help me welcome Keith Knop. Keith is the head of the music cataloging section at the University of Georgia Libraries and is currently chair of the Content Standards Subcommittee of MLA's Cataloging and Metadata Committee. He has previously given workshops on cataloging audio and video materials and has taught music cataloging for the University of Buffalo. Prior to coming to UGA, he was associate music cataloger at Florida State University's Warren D. Allen Music Library for 10 years. In addition to his MLIS, he holds a PhD in musicology from Florida State. So thank you, Steve. Thank you, Keith. And please go ahead and take it from here.
Okay, so everybody hear me and see everything fine?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, so I'm given to understand that people are concerned about aggregates, and so I am prepared to talk about aggregates to the extent that I know anything. And let's start with the aggregate model and why. So original RDA kind of tacitly acknowledged this notion that compilations were works in their own right, but it never really actually defined what that means in practical terms, and it didn't really explore the wider ramifications for what that actually meant in terms of describing things. So then at the implementation level in original RDA, LCPCC opted not to implement Chapter 17, which is the one that covered recording primary relationships. That is, the relationships between a work and its own expressions, an expression and its own manifestations, and so on and so forth. And as a result of those two things, those of us, at least those who were following LCPCC practice, had no clear way to express the concept that this compilation X expresses this work Y plus work Z, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then comes the kludge, which catalogers seem to have collectively settled on using the whole part container of relationships to record what in hindsight really ought to have been a simple primary relationship by claiming that this compilation, considered as a work in its own right, contains all of these other unrelated works or expressions. That has some wider repercussions, which I will get to in a little bit later on. Okay, so what is the aggregate model? So the aggregate model is an attempt to codify what exactly it means for a manifestation to contain multiple distinct expressions, and it defines various ways of treating them. So an aggregate is any manifestation that simultaneously presents two or more expressions of works, such as a collection or a compilation of expressions of different works, which is called a collection aggregate. So something like an anthology or an album. But you can also have multiple expressions of the same work, such as works in multiple languages or formats, which is called a parallel aggregate. So a vocal score that has the original text plus a singing translation, or a score and a set of parts would both be examples of parallel aggregates. And then you have an expression of one primary work that is accompanied by one or more supporting works, which is called an augmentation aggregate. So an addition of a score with a critical commentary associated with it, or a recording that comes with liner notes, those are both examples of augmentation aggregates. An aggregating work is the plan to create an aggregate. It has one and only one aggregating expression, which in most cases is so nebulous, a concept that it's basically totally ignorable. It has no content in and of itself. So let's talk about the unfortunate vocabulary, because this model involves parsing many similar words that are in close proximity to one another in very similar contexts, and it can get pretty confusing. So aggregating works and expressions consist solely of plans to create aggregates. Works and expressions that are aggregated have no direct relationship to the aggregating work or expression. And the resulting aggregate is not a work or an expression, but a manifestation of both the aggregating and aggregated works and expressions. And finally, in print, the words aggregate and aggregate appear identical, which can occasionally make things pretty complicated if there's no context to figure out which one is intended. Now, that's all very abstract, so I'm going to trot out an analogy I have used several times before, and I know some of you will have seen this, but it seems to work, so I recycle it. I like to think of an aggregate as something akin to a jar of marbles. If I decide to put a marble in a jar, the marble does not become a part of the jar. It remains a separately created entity, which is related to the jar only insofar as I, as an unrelated third party, say that it is. And likewise, if I decide to collect a song in an anthology, I have not altered the laws of causality to magically make that song part of the anthology. Nor have I magically created a sibling relationship between that song and all of the other songs that I've collected. So that has, as I mentioned earlier, some practical as well as theoretical ramifications. So if I say the words Primo and Ferber clusters and you recoil in horror, then this is part of the reason why. And if you don't know what that means, then thank your lucky stars. Because when we use that container of relationship, which has now been renamed part relationship for this purpose, we are asserting a work-to-work connection that is imposed by some third party rather than naturally formed. And there's not an easy way to tell the difference between something that's been externally imposed and something that hasn't been. So an aggregate, the jar in this example, is the manifestation that simultaneously manifests these two classes of things. So first of all, it manifests the aggregating work and the aggregating expression, which again consists solely of the plans to create an aggregate. And second, it manifests two or more expressions of one or more works, which are the marbles in this example, which have been selected according to the plan. So my plans to create a jar full of marbles constitute the aggregating work and expression, and the marbles themselves remain conceptually separate. And there's no direct relationship between the aggregating work and expression and the works and expressions that have been aggregated. Their only connection is that they both happen to be embodied in the same manifestation. And so one last point to mention is that we don't really have time to get into representative expressions today, but the representative expression of an aggregating work is not, according to RDA, the aggregating expression, which, as I mentioned, is usually so nebulous that it might as well not exist, but rather the combined total of the expressions that have been aggregated. Okay, so where do you look to find information about aggregates? Well, unfortunately, lots of places. The good news, though, is that despite the abundance of information sources, they do tend to converge towards the same information. So you can find out the same thing through multiple channels, usually. In RDA proper, looking at the big picture, there are two guidance chapters with relevant content. Most obviously, there's the one on aggregates. But also in terms of actual description, the aggregates chapter is going to point you to the resource description chapter and the sections on describing aggregates and the things they aggregate. So there are subsections on describing manifestations, expressions, and works, and there are subsections under those subsections that deal specifically with aggregates in the case of manifestations and things that are aggregated and things that do the aggregating in the case of expressions and works. At the more detailed level, we have several descriptive elements that either are specific to aggregates or aggregating works and expressions, or that have special relevance or special treatment when we catalog aggregates. Those include manifestation elements like contributor agents to aggregate and its narrower elements such as contributor person of music, expression manifested and work manifested, and the expression elements aggregates, not aggregates, but aggregates, and its inverse aggregated by various access points for expression and manifestation of expression, which is the inverse of expression manifested. However, the only ones of those that you will routinely need to worry about for standard bibliographic music cataloging in MARC are expression manifested and authorized access point for expression. The others are either going to be optional in a lot of cases, or in some cases are explicitly not used in current LCPCC practice. So outside of RDA itself, but still within the RDA toolkit, you've also got LCPCC policy statements and MLA best practices for all of the elements and chapters that have been mentioned on the previous slide. But outside of the toolkit, you've also got the LCPCC metadata guidance documents, and also the MLA RDA metadata guidance document, which is not quite so robust, but it's getting there. In the LCPCC documentation, those are divided into what they call narrative metadata guidance documents, which are sort of the big picture overview that tend to be more step-by-step and tend to give you an overview of multiple elements and then how to treat things. So there's one of those for aggregates. I just did it, which is going to contain the vast amount of guidance or pointers to the guidance that you need for this. But there's also a bit of relevant information in the one on WIMI to WIMI relationships. There are also what they call entity-specific metadata guidance documents. So under expression, there's one on authorized access point for expression. And then there are also lists of relationship labels, because the old relationship designators in original RDA have been multiplied by 5 and turned into elements. And they're not very user-friendly, even less so than the old relationship designators. So PCC has come up with a list of more user-friendly labels, which in some cases combine multiple elements into a single label. And so the ones that get referenced, at least in this presentation, are the labels for expression to person and expression to corporate body relationships. And in the MLA RDA beta guidance document, there's a relatively small section on aggregates and a slightly larger subsection on authorized access points for aggregating works and expressions, because there are some special cases that come up, which I'll get into a little bit more later on. Okay, so one last thing before we get into aggregate description, and that's a digression about expression access points. And it's worth delving into those because for much of RDA history, we have kind of treated expression access points as afterthoughts, something that you only use when a work access point won't cut it for some reason. And then, at least in my case, I can't really speak for anybody else, only kind of reluctantly. But that is changing in LCPCC practice. So work access points in bibliographic records will pretty much be exclusively for related works or subject headings. And recording the content manifested by a manifestation will exclusively use the expression manifested element, which means using expression access points. And there is an element, work manifested, which shortcuts that work expressed, expression manifested chain of relationships to link manifestation and work directly, but that will not be used by LC or PCC. Now, I was kind of alarmed when that decision was announced, because for a while it seemed like some people were keen to start piling on qualifiers to make every expression access point unique. And given how many expressions there are of some musical works, that is clearly unsustainable. But don't panic. Mostly, this is a change in how we conceptualize relationships in the background. So just remember that access points are just labels, and while we like access points for works to be unique, access points for expressions don't necessarily need to be. And an access point for an expression may be qualified to specifically identify a particular expression, but there is no requirement to do so. If we look at the descriptive element access point for expression, there is an option there which tells us use the authorized access point for the work expressed as the base for an expression access point. So any expression access point is going to start with the access point for the work. LCPCCPS tells us, yes, do that. There is a section there on additional elements and designations that you can add to access points for expression. The MLA best practices say generally don't make additions to the base access point if the expression may be broadly considered a representative expression. And the LCPCC metadata guidance document for authorized access point for expression tells us that we should make additions to access points only for translations or language additions, certain types of sacred scriptures, and music resources, which I'll get to a little bit in more detail in just a bit. There is no requirement to distinguish between translations, arrangements, and so forth in the access point, at least in LC practice. PCC practice, you may do that if you wish to. And PCC practice, and this is kind of approaching what the MLA best practices are saying in a different way, PCC catalogers may use the authorized access point for the work to represent any expression in the work's original language. Well, in music, we also worry about other things that might make something representative or not, like key and medium of performance. So it's not quite the same thing, but it's the same spirit there. And then in community resources, under authorized access point for expression of musical works, LC practice is to make additions only for translations, arrangements, vocal and chorus scores, and sketches. Okay. And then within the MLA RDA metadata guidance document, I mentioned there were some details under authorized access points for aggregating works and expressions. There is a section that addresses what it's most likely to come up with in frankly, is popular music albums and certain other types of musical aggregate. So this is a change in policy that came about both due to changes in wording in RDA and PCC awareness that popular music had long been a sticking point in original RDA. So the full details are in the MLA metadata guidance document, but in short, under certain conditions, you can use the name of a common creator of all of the expressions that are aggregated, like a performer, as the qualifier for an access point, rather than a creator of all of the works that are aggregated. Mostly, this is limited to musical traditions where public and scholarly interest is focused on RDA expressions rather than RDA works. And that largely excludes art music. So let's talk about actually describing aggregates. RDA provides some general guidance in the aggregates chapter under describing an aggregate, and it gives us 3 points to chew on. First of all, it's not necessary to record all of the expressions or works that are embodied by an aggregate. In plain language, what that means is that you can choose to ignore some of the works or expressions in an aggregate if they aren't deemed significant. It is not necessary to record any of the expressions or works that are aggregated if the aggregating expression or work is recorded. So in plain language, that means you can describe the aggregate as a whole and not worry about getting into the nitty-gritty details of the contents. It is not necessary to record the aggregating expression or work if at least one of the expressions or works that are aggregated is recorded. So that basically is saying you can record one or more of the works or expressions in an aggregate and ignore the aggregating work entirely. And we'll look at use cases for each of those things. So as far as specific details, if we look in the resource description chapter, describing a manifestation, we've got several options. And as with most RDA options, these are not mutually exclusive. So first option is to record information about aggregated expressions as a note. Okay, well, LCP-CPS says that's cataloger's judgment for augmenting and parallel content, but you can also put augmenting content in a contents note. For collections, definitely provide a contents note. The next option says to relate the aggregate to the aggregating expression using the expression manifested relationship. In LCP-CPS, it says to do that for collection aggregates, but not for parallel or augmentation aggregates. Now, what this is basically saying is that you are going to have an access point for the aggregating worker expression. This is going to be your greatest hits of Kenny G. This is your 37 Italian arias that everyone's sick of hearing. This is your access point to the collection. So in the narrative metadata guidance document for aggregates, it basically tells us that in MARC, the aggregate has expression manifested relationship is going to be expressed by recording an access point using any of field 130, field 1XX plus 240, field 1XX plus 245 if you don't have a 240, or if there is no 1XX, just field 245. Okay, next option, relate the aggregate to individual aggregated expressions using the expression manifested relationship. Okay, so this would be analytical access to the content of an aggregate. LCP-CPS says, yes, do that for the primary content of an augmentation aggregate and its cataloger's judgment for augmenting content. Yes, do it for the original language content, if present in a parallel aggregate, and at least for the first translation, and cataloger's judgment for second or later translations, and apply for the first or predominant expression in the collection aggregate and cataloger's judgment for other aggregated expressions. So in music cataloging, we generally encourage a more all or nothing approach, but you can adjust as your resources require. So in the narrative metadata guidance document for aggregates, so in MARC, the primary content and or the original language are going to be what you identify in your 1XX, 2XX fields. So access points for augmenting expressions or additional translations are all going to go in your 7XX fields. For a collection aggregate, the aggregating worker expression is going to be identified in your 1XX, 2XX. So access points for the aggregated expressions will all be in your 7XX fields, plus optionally, also in a contents note, unless the contents are indicated in another part of the description. Okay, next option, to relate the manifestation to the aggregating work using the work manifested shortcut relationship. Well, as I mentioned previously, LCP-CPS is not to use that, use expression manifested instead. And the next option, basically the same thing, relate the individual aggregated expressions using work manifested. Don't do that either. So next option, relate the aggregate to individual creators of aggregated expressions using the contributor agent to aggregate relationship, or a narrower one. So guidance there says it really only addresses directly the question of illustrators and writers of supplementary text. Otherwise, the only thing you get is record contributors for expressions if they are considered important for retrieval. Now, the narrower element that covers all of music is contributor agent of music, or contributor person of music, or contributor corporate body of music, so on and so forth, which is unhelpfully vague. So a more helpful approach is probably to follow the MLA best practice under statement of responsibility, where there is an option that says record a separate value of expression, creator agent of expression for or a subtype for each of one or more expressions or agents. And MLA recommends that you do that for editors, arrangers, translators, solo performers, conductors, and performing ensembles in manifestations of notated or performed music, and other things, other types of agent are left to cataloger's judgment. Okay, and final option, record details about aggregated expressions using the accessibility content, color content, illustrative content, sound content, or supplementary content elements. Supplementary content is LCPCC core for indexes and bibliographies and monographs. Illustrative content is core for materials intended for children, and everything else is more or less cataloger's judgment. You can use a note to indicate those, or a more specific mark field. It's basically up to local practice there. So let's actually summarize that process for the various types of aggregates, starting with collection aggregates. A collection aggregate manifests two or more expressions of two or more works, which are of approximately equal emphasis. So what you're going to do is you're going to provide access to the aggregating expression by recording the expression manifested element. So basically, you're going to record an access point for the compilation itself. It doesn't need a relationship label attached to it, because that is implied by any of the 130, 1XX240, 1XX245, or lone 245 fields. Record a contents note, unless the contents are already indicated elsewhere in the description. But if a full contents note would be impractical or unduly burdensome, you can omit or abridge that. And if feasible, also relate your individual expressions aggregated to the manifestation using the expression manifested element. So an example, the option to record information about one or more of the expressions using a note, which is the simplest option. This could be a general 500 note or a contents note, full or abridged, and this example shows both of those things. So we are providing access to the collection aggregate, or to the aggregating work with the 245. There's no 100 necessary, because it's there's no single point of responsibility here. We have both a general summary note indicating the nature of the content, and a sort of abridged contents note that gives the sections of the hymnal rather than all 542 hymn titles. And this is amplified in the MLA documentation for aggregates, which says, for especially extensive compilations, a complete contents note may be impractical and may be abridged or omitted entirely. But if you do omit one, include some sort of general summary. And just FYI, this is actually taken directly from an AACR2 record with no changes necessary. So example number 2, recording information about one or more of the expressions using a note on manifestation. Again, we are providing access to the aggregating work. In this case, it's through a 100-245 combination, and it is taking advantage of that revised policy, allowing us in certain cases to use the common creator of expression rather than the common creator of works to qualify the access point. So this is an album, a jazz album. And here we have a complete contents note And third example, to relate the aggregate to one or more of the individual expressions aggregated using more formal means. So again, access to the aggregating work, following the guidance on statement of responsibility. This has 2 editors associated with it. So we are now recording the creator agent of expression for each of those editors. And then recording expression manifested for each of the 2 works that are included. We don't need a contents note because the complete contents are already indicated in the title proper, Symphonies number 1 and 2 by Florence Price. Okay, so before we move on from collection aggregates, it's worth addressing the issue of aggregating works versus whole part work relationships, because sometimes the line between those two can get blurry. And sometimes if you start asking questions, you might not like the answers. So in original RDA, whole part work relationships were indicated using the kludge that I mentioned earlier, those container of work relationships and contained in work relationship designators. In RDA, those relationships had been renamed. So container of work is now part work, and contained in work is now part of work. And there are also parallel elements for expressions, so part expression and part of expression. So a part work is defined as a work that is a discrete component of another work and is considered to be essential to the whole work. Now remember that an aggregating work has no intellectual content other than a plan to gather multiple expressions together. So it cannot form a whole part relationship with the works that are collected in an aggregate. And the PCC approved relationship labels for these elements, but whether work or expression, are just part and part of. Now, there are things that we can look at and say they are definitely whole part relationships, like the aria A Fuggi il Traditore from Don Giovanni. We can say that the opera Don Giovanni has the part A Fuggi il Traditore, and the aria A Fuggi il Traditore is part of the opera Don Giovanni. Okay, great, fine. And that's mostly going to be relevant in an authorities context. There are things that we can look at and say are definitely not whole part relationships, like the album The Art of Renee Fleming, which includes a performance of Leonard Cohen's song Hallelujah. We can't say that Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah is part of the album The Art of Renee Fleming. What we can say is that the album The Art of Renee Fleming has expression manifested, Cohen, Leonard, Hallelujah. And if we wanted to, we could further qualify to specify that it is specifically one particular performance. But again, you're not required to do so. But then we get into the questions you might not like the answer to situation. So if you look at Brahms' Opus 86 Lieder, or all the sonatas in Corelli's Opus 5 violin sonatas, are those part of a single unified work, or are they just aggregated together in an aggregating work that happened to be created by the composer? We could get into some potentially hairy ontological debates there, but here's the good news, which is that for bibliographic cataloging, it really doesn't matter that much. Because again, authorized access points are just labels. And as far as the larger work is concerned, it doesn't matter whether the label is pointing to an aggregating work or to a work that has parts. The only thing that matters is that it's pointing users to the thing that they actually want. And for the smaller work, even if it isn't actually part of the larger work, music authorized access points already have a lot of labeling conventions that differ from those in general use. So really, what's one more? So until you hear otherwise, don't fret. Okay, moving on to parallel aggregates. A parallel aggregate manifests two or more expressions of the same work, such as the same work in multiple languages, the same work in multiple formats of notated music, or potentially even the same work in the same language, but in multiple scripts. For parallels that come about as a result of translation, the practice is unchanged from what we're doing right now. So you're going to record an access point for the original language version if it's present, and at least the first translation that's included. And you can also record access points for further translations if they're deemed helpful. For multiple formats of musical notation, you really don't have to do anything special at all. You don't need to provide direct access to specific expressions. So you can describe formats of musical notation as they relate to the aggregate just by accounting for them as appropriate in any number of places, like an addition statement, if there is one, and it's applicable to the resource as a whole. So score and parts. You can indicate that in extent of manifestation. You can indicate that by recording the format of musical notation as its own element in field 348. You could even indicate it using genre subdivisions or headings. In other words, keep doing what you've been doing. And then other parallel expressions can be handled in a similar fashion. So if you have, for example, a score that has lyrics in the same language, but in both the vernacular script and Romanized, then you could include both scripts alongside your language note in field 546 subfield B. Or if you have something that is notated in multiple formats, like lute tablature with a staff notation transcription, you could include both of those in field 348C. Examples. One option is to relate the aggregate to one or more individual expressions aggregated. So here we have a parallel aggregate, which is Monkey See, Monkey Do, a one-act opera for children, which is in English, but also includes a singing translation in Spanish. So we provide access to the original language expression in our 10240. We include an access point for the translator as a matter of good practice. And we provide access to at least the first translation. In this case, there is only one translation, so it's the only one we have to worry about. And we do not specifically have to identify this one translation in the access point, although, again, in PCC practice, you could if you wanted to. Another example is to ignore the aggregating expression entirely, which is what we do here. So we've got a saxophone quartet piece called Zombie Apocalypse, which is presented as a score and a part. For a parallel aggregate, we don't need to record an AAP for the aggregating expression. We ignore it entirely and just use the work access point as a stand-in for our representative expression. And then it's not necessary to record the aggregating expression if at least one of the expressions aggregated is recorded, which is what we're doing here. For multiple formats of musical notation, you really don't have to do anything other than note the extent and dimension for each expression and to acknowledge the aggregate nature of the manifestation. And finally, for augmentation aggregates. An augmentation aggregate manifests two or more works where one or some of the works are supplementary to the primary work or works. So critical commentary in a scholarly edition, liner notes that go with an album, bonus features on a DVD. Describing augmenting content is almost all catalogers' judgment. So you can relate the aggregate to the primary content, not the aggregating work or expression, but the main thing that's aggregated using the expression manifested element. You can describe augmenting content using a note, including a contents note if appropriate, if you deem it useful. A couple of exceptions: supplementary content is required for indexes and bibliographies for monographs, according to LCPCC. And if you deem it especially significant, you can relate the supplementary content using the expression manifested element. So examples of that, augmenting content described in a note. So two examples here. You've got Brahms symphonies with a preface and introduction in German and a critical commentary. And then we've got just a preface and biographical note in another work. And in both cases, we are providing direct access to the primary content using expression manifested and indicating supplementary content in a note if it's of special importance or would aid in identification or selection. We can also use a formal contents note if it is worthy of that. So for an augmentation aggregate, provide access to the primary content. So two examples here again, the film Bohemian Rhapsody and a concert recording of Tupac. And in both cases here, you've got augmenting content, Blu-ray special features in the first case, and bonus music videos in the second case, which are indicated in a contents node. But it is, of course, possible for something to belong to more than one kind of aggregate at the same time. So if you've got a greatest hits album with liner notes, or an anthology of German songs with English singing translations and a critical commentary, what do you do then? Because sometimes the guidance for different types of aggregates is contradictory, like access to the aggregating work for collection and non-collection aggregates. What do you do? Well, it's not explicitly stated anywhere, but if you look at everything as a whole, what it basically boils down to is a priority order when multiple types apply and instructions contradict. So apply the instructions for collection aggregates first, then parallel aggregates, and then finally augmentation aggregates. And that about wraps up what I have to say. So I will throw the floor open to questions. And there's a lot of stuff in the chat. So hopefully somebody can direct me to some of those questions, because I'm sure there have been many.
Casey had a question about parallel aggregates.
Yes, Casey, would you like to go ahead and ask that? Because I have no idea where it is in chat.
Oh, it's just there was an example where you had one of the parallel expressions in a 240 and the other in a 700. And my understanding based on the MGDs is that they would both go into 700, but maybe I'm behind in my understanding.
That is also possible. You may be correct there. That is a habitual thing that I have been trying to wean myself off of using 240s whenever possible. So, but I suspect that you may be correct there. It might be more appropriate to have them both in a 700.
Chuck has a question. Why don't you go ahead, Chuck? Peters, sorry.
Thanks, Keith. You did such a good job. I feel like I'm having a panic attack. But I have a serious question, and that is, do you envision very much bibliographic maintenance required once we get started following this kind of practice in our legacy content?
Honestly, no. I mean, the biggest thing is that all of those container of works will have to be flipped to part, and that's 90. I'm going to call it. I'm making this number up, but that's 98% of everything is probably going to be covered by that. Where things might get weird is issues and things with conventional collective titles, because those have been in a weird place for a long time, and they will probably continue to be in a weird place for a while. I know LC has been gradually moving away from using especially collection or selections, conventional collectives titles for a while, including with some musical works now as well. But there are still cases where, I don't know, it's kind of a work access point, but it's not a unique work access point, and that's making things weird. So I don't know where that's going to go. Let's see, Hermina said they shouldn't all be part right. Some of them should be expression manifested. Well, oh yeah, you're correct. I said that entirely wrong. They should all be converted from container of work or container of expression to expression manifested. Yes, none of those would be part, because that's basically, the part relationships are going to be used almost exclusively, I would imagine, in the authorities context.
Does anyone else have any questions for Keith? Oh, it looks like one just came across on the chat.
I'm going to stop sharing so I can actually see if people have their hands up.
And this question is from Tom Peace. It says, will part of RDs affect series fields?
I don't believe series fields will be affected because, I mean, series and RDA, that's its own nightmare right there. And I have avoided thinking about that as much as possible, but it's not going to affect your 490 at all in any way I can think of. It might possibly have some effect on 830s, but I don't believe LC traces those anymore. I see Damien has his hand up and possibly he has an answer to that, or maybe another question.
Yeah, that's to respond to what Tom said. When I was in the group helping hash this stuff out about series, we explicitly made a recommendation, and I can't remember, it's in the MGDs now, that we would only use that we wouldn't use relationship designators with series access points in the 800s. And I think it's in there actually, just because we have this huge thing of past practice built up, and that was a sort of a red line for a lot of people. So no, we don't use RDs for the series access points in LC's interpretation and PC's interpretation of series.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I would love to leave the floor open for some more questions, but we've gone a little bit over and I don't want to take too much of Chuck's time for his next presentation. So I don't know if we all want to clap virtually or put your reactions up on the screen, but I would like to thank you, Keith, for your presentation. This has been really interesting. And I hope that if people have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to Keith and ask your questions, and we'll go from there. So thank you, Keith.